The beeping of the monitors was louder than his shallow breaths, and I couldn't bear it any longer. I leaned over his frail body, whispered, "I love you." And for the first time in days, I allowed myself to let go. I kissed his forehead, stepped back, and walked out of the hospital room, my heels clicking against the sterile floor like a countdown. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and death. I felt numb, my chest heavy with grief I didn't know how to carry. I told the nurses at the desk I was leaving for a while. I didn't think anyone would notice. And then I heard them. Two nurses, speaking in low voices just beyond the elevator. "Can you believe she actually left him like that?" one said, shaking her head. "I know. Who abandons someone like that when they're dying? Unreal." I froze. My blood ran cold, my stomach twisted. I should have been furious. I should have turned and defended myself. But instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I listened. They didn't know I could hear. And they didn't know what I knew. Because what they didn't see was the months before this, the hidden truths of my husband's life. The bills he had racked up in secret. The money he had gambled away while pretending he was saving for our future. The lies he told me to keep his vices hidden. And as much as I loved him, the man in that hospital bed wasn't the man I thought I had married. He was a stranger wearing my husband's face. I walked to the small hospital cafe, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and let my mind turn over possibilities. Patience had always been my secret weapon. I wasn't impulsive. I didn't need revenge in screams or violence. I needed it quiet, thorough, in a way that would leave him powerless even in death. I returned home and went straight to his study. Hidden in a drawer were documents he thought I'd never find, accounts under false names. Investments that were actually debts, contracts I hadn't signed but he had forged. I spent the next week in silence, calling lawyers, accountants, tracing every cent. I didn't tell a soul. Not my friends, not my family. No one could touch what I was about to do. When the call came that he had passed, I barely flinched. I had already calculated every move, every loophole, every advantage I could take. While the world expected grief, I had already turned loss into power. The funeral was crowded, mourners everywhere, heads bowed, tissues in hands. And I stood at the back, listening as everyone praised him, the perfect husband, the generous man. They didn't know. They didn't see the truth. And that's when I made my move. Through lawyers, I uncovered the full scale of his debts, all hidden beneath shell companies and false statements. The creditors came knocking, and I simply stepped aside. The banks froze his accounts. His investments were seized, and the properties he bragged about were liquidated to pay off what he owed. Friends called, confused. Family asked questions, and I said nothing. Silence was my weapon. No explanations, no tears, no justifications. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the man they remembered had vanished. His wealth, his status, the image he had curated, gone. His name, which once opened doors, now opened only statements of debt. It was perfect, not cruel, not petty, just truth, the unvarnished reality of the man he had been. And in that, I found satisfaction. Months later, I returned to his empty study. The silence was sweeter than I expected. No phone calls, no letters. Just the sound of my own breathing and the calm of a life reclaimed. I never flaunted what I had done. There was no need. The real revenge had been quiet, almost invisible. It had taken patience, planning, and restraint, but it was absolute. Sometimes at night, I think about those nurses. The disbelief in their voices. How little they knew. How much they had judged. I let them think what they wanted. Their judgment didn't matter anymore. Because I had said goodbye to the man I loved, walked out when I had to, and turned the consequences of his lies into justice. And for the first time in years, I felt free. No shouting, no confrontation, no anger, just the quiet satisfaction that sometimes the smartest revenge is patience, and the strongest love is knowing when to walk away. He left this world thinking he had the upper hand. I left it knowing I always would. The strange thing is, that wasn't the end of it. A week after the funeral, I went back to the hospital to return some paperwork they'd mailed to the house by mistake. I stood at the same desk, the same hallway, the same smell. And there they were again, those two nurses. They recognized me instantly. Their faces changed. Not anger, not judgment, awkwardness. One of them cleared her throat. "I'm sorry for your loss." I nodded. Calm. Steady. "Thank you." Then the other one spoke, hesitating. "We didn't know everything about what you were dealing with, so they had found out." Of course they had. Hospitals talk. Lawyers talk. Creditors talk louder than anyone. I smiled politely. Not smug. Not bitter, just finished. "It's okay," I said. "People only see the last moment. They rarely see the years before it." They said nothing after that. Neither did I. And that's how I knew it was done. The house felt different once all the legal dust settled. Lighter. Like it had been holding its breath for years, and finally exhaled. I donated most of his things. Suits he wore to impress people. Watches he bought to feel important. I kept nothing that belonged to the lie. What I kept were the small things. A photo from before everything changed. A note he once left on the fridge, when love was still simple. Proof that the man I married had existed, before secrets hollowed him out. People still whispered. Some thought I was cold. Others thought I was ruthless. None of them knew how many nights I stayed awake, staring at ceilings, wondering where I went wrong. How long I tried to save someone who was already drowning in choices I didn't make. They didn't know how many times I forgave quietly, or how tired forgiveness can make you. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting someone back. Sometimes it's about refusing to carry their weight after they're gone. I didn't destroy his name. I let the truth finish the job. And that truth followed him into every conversation, every record, every memory people tried to preserve. Not because I exposed him publicly, but because lies collapse when no one is left to protect them. Now, when I pass hospitals, I don't feel guilt. I feel clarity. I said goodbye when I still could. I walked away when I had to. And I listened when the world finally spoke the truth out loud. He died believing his secrets would survive him. They didn't. And I lived, finally free, finally silent, finally done, knowing that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't what you say. It's what you stop protecting. Weeks turned into months, and the hospital memory never left me. I found myself walking past the corridor, where I had heard those nurses talking. The same smell of antiseptic hitting me like a punch I couldn't dodge. One afternoon, curiosity, or maybe instinct, made me stop. I lingered near the nurse's station, pretending to check the schedule, and I overheard snippets of conversation again. Her husband. I heard the truth after he passed. Everything she did, it was smart, ruthless, but fair. She didn't just walk away. She waited, and then she let the truth do the work. I smiled quietly. They didn't know I could hear. But I did, and I knew they were right. Because the truth had been my quiet ally from the moment I stepped out of that hospital room. Every account frozen, every debt revealed, every property reclaimed. It had all been part of the plan I didn't need to announce. And watching life follow through on its own was sweeter than anything I could have done with anger or confrontation. Months later, I received a letter. No signature. No return address. Just an envelope with my husband's name, written in a familiar hand, his lawyer's. It contained his final statements. Updates to accounts he'd never told me about. Everything now clearly outlined, and a note at the bottoms. She did what needed to be done, and she did it without losing herself. I let it sit on the table for a few days. I didn't need it to validate me. I already knew. I had walked out once. I had let the nurses talk. I had listened. And then I had acted with patience and precision. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came quietly. As I watched the world adjust itself to the truth I had let unfold. Friends who had once praised him now realized the depth of his deceit. Creditors settled quietly. Lawyers moved silently. And I reclaimed a life I hadn't realized I was still owed. Years later, when someone mentions him, I don't feel anger. I feel calm. I feel control. I feel the kind of peace that comes from knowing justice doesn't always need confrontation. Sometimes, it only needs observation, patience, and the courage to walk away when everyone expects you to stay. He left this world thinking he could hide the truth forever. I left it knowing I had already won. And the quiet satisfaction, the one the nurses never imagined, was enough to fill every empty corner that grief had once occupied. The strangest part came months later, when the hospital called me about an old account of his, one he had forgotten to update. I went to sign the paperwork, expecting bureaucracy. Instead, I found the same nurses behind the desk, older faces, but still sharp eyes. They recognized me immediately, and this time, their expressions weren't judgmental or surprised. They were respectful. "I just want you to know," one said quietly. "We hear stories like yours sometimes, but rarely with this kind of resolve. You didn't just leave. You waited. You listened. And then you acted." I nodded, letting the acknowledgement settle. I said nothing about the months of planning, the quiet evenings spent untangling his hidden life, the sleepless nights making sure every step was calculated. Silence had been my ally, patience my weapon, and justice had arrived quietly, in ways no one could ignore. I walked out of that hospital for the last time and felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had destroyed him, not because I had exposed his secrets, but because I had refused to be powerless. I had refused to let grief or betrayal dictate my life. I had taken control of my own story, and that control felt like freedom. Later, friends who once whispered about my coldness approached me. "How did you do it?" they asked, voice cautious. I smiled. "I simply let the truth do the work," I said. They didn't understand. They couldn't. Revenge, real revenge, isn't about shouting or showing off. It's about patience, silence, and letting consequences fall naturally. I never needed to brag. I never needed to explain. Every hidden account, every falsified document, every debt and secret he thought would survive him had unraveled on its own. And watching it happen, knowing it was right, was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Years later, when I walk past hospitals, I don't feel pain. I feel clarity. The same clarity I felt that day when I said goodbye and stepped away from the beeping monitors, the cold bed, and the man who had once been my husband. He died thinking he had the upper hand. I left knowing I always would. And the quiet, smart, patient revenge, the one that doesn't shout but leaves no question, was enough. It always is. Months turned into years, and the memory of that hospital corridor never left me. Every time I walked past a hospital or saw a nurse in scrubs, I felt that same tight knot in my chest, the one that had been there the moment I walked out and heard them talking. One afternoon, I returned for a routine checkup. I wandered past the same nurse's station, half expecting to be ignored, half expecting judgment. But one of the nurses looked up, recognition flashing in her eyes. She gave a small nod. No words, just acknowledgement. I nodded back. That small gesture carried more weight than any apology or explanation could have. By then, my husband's secrets had completely unraveled. Every hidden account, every forged document, every lie he had carefully built to protect his reputation collapsed quietly, without me lifting a finger. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to shout, accuse, or fight. The law and the truth did it for me. And the satisfaction? It was absolute. Not loud, not showy. Just pure, quiet, undeniable. I think about that day often. The first time I left him in that hospital room, kissed his forehead, and walked away. How the nurses' voices cut into me. How I felt a mix of grief, disbelief, and the sudden realization that I had a choice. I chose patience. I chose silence. I chose strategy, and it worked. Friends and family still ask how I did it, how I navigated everything without losing my mind. I tell them simply I walked away. I let the world speak. I let the truth unfold. There's no sweeter revenge than watching a life built on lies collapse quietly, without you needing to lift a hand. There's no satisfaction like knowing the man who thought he controlled everything couldn't touch you, even in death. Now, when I pass hospitals, I no longer feel grief or anger. I feel clarity. I know that walking out that day was the smartest decision I ever made. I know that patience, silence, and careful observation gave me power no rage could ever give. He died thinking he had the upper hand. I left knowing I always would. And sometimes, the smartest revenge isn't violent or dramatic. It's quiet, deliberate, and absolute. It's the kind that follows people for the rest of their lives, long after they think the story is over. And that, finally, was enough. Years later, the memory of that hospital hallway still haunts me, but in a way that feels like proof of everything I survived. I had returned there once, months after he passed, for something routine. The nurses at the station recognized me immediately. One of them hesitated, then whispered, We didn't understand until it all came out. What you did. It wasn't easy, but it was perfect. I nodded, letting the words sink. Perfect. That was the truth. Because I hadn't acted out of anger. I hadn't lashed out in grief, or let the world see me crumble. I had listened when the nurses had spoken, waited when the moment felt unbearable, and acted only when I had everything in place. Every account traced, every secret exposed, every loophole sealed. Every move precise. The world expected me to sob, to beg, to look powerless. Instead, I walked away that day, then returned later to let reality do its work. My husband's hidden debts, his lies, the life he had carefully constructed, they collapsed on their own. I didn't have to fight for it. Silence, patience, and timing had done it better than any confrontation ever could. The satisfaction didn't scream. It whispered. It was in the letters I found, the accounts I reclaimed, the people finally seeing the truth of him for the first time. It was in the quiet pride of knowing I had refused to be manipulated, even in grief. Friends and family still ask me how I managed it, how I could stand so tall when the world expected me to fall. I tell them. I walked away. I listened, and I let the truth do the rest. They don't fully understand, but that doesn't matter. The truth works quietly, invisibly, and completely. Now, when I pass a hospital, I don't flinch. I don't recall the monitors or the sterile smell with dread. I remember the moment I finally chose myself. The moment I let silence and patience become my allies. He died thinking he still had control. I left knowing I always would. The real revenge doesn't shout. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't demand attention. It waits. It is patient. It is absolute. And it lasts far longer than anger ever could. The quietest part of it all came long after the funeral, when the world had forgotten the man he pretended to be. But I hadn't. I went through his old office again, just to clear the remaining clutter. A drawer I hadn't opened before yielded a small stack of envelopes, unopened bills, letters, and notes he had hidden from me. I didn't need to read most of them. I knew what they contained. And then I smiled. Not because I was cruel. Not because I wanted to hurt him in death. But because the power he thought he had was gone. Completely. Every asset, every secret, every carefully hidden piece of his life had been revealed and reclaimed. The man who had controlled everything in life now controlled nothing. Months later, I ran into one of the nurses again at a pharmacy. She hesitated, then said softly, You handled it well. Better than most. I hope you know that." I nodded, letting her words settle like sunlight through a window. She didn't need to know the late nights I spent planning, the careful patience it took, the way I walked out of that hospital room and never looked back. Not angrily, not in tears, but decisively. The truth had done everything for me, and the satisfaction of watching it unfold quietly, invisibly, was sweeter than any confrontation could have been. I never had to speak to him again, never had to justify myself, never had to yell. Life itself executed the reckoning. Sometimes, revenge is thought of as something loud, dramatic, unforgettable in a single moment. But the most satisfying revenge is quiet, measured, and intelligent. It lingers in the world, long after everyone else has moved on, reshaping reality without anyone noticing, except you. I think about that first walk down the hospital corridor often. The beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic, the voices of the nurses I wasn't supposed to hear. I remember the weight in my chest, the tightness in my throat, and the cold clarity that told me exactly what I had to do. I kissed him goodbye that day, walked away, and let the truth catch up to him. And it did. Years later, I can walk past that hospital, past the nurses, past the memories, and feel nothing but calm. The man who thought he controlled everything is gone. But I am still here, whole, unshaken, free. He left thinking he had the upper hand. I left knowing I always would, and that is the kind of revenge that doesn't fade. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that lasts a lifetime. The strangest part is how quiet it all felt in the months after he died. No one congratulated me. No one even noticed what had happened. But I knew. I knew every hidden account that was frozen, every debt revealed, every lie exposed without me having to raise my voice. The world assumed I was grieving. I let them. Let them pity me. Let them whisper. Because none of them saw what I saw. None of them knew I had walked out of that hospital room the day he died and started a slow, silent reckoning that would leave him powerless even in death. I remember sitting in my living room one night, staring at his desk. A single envelope lay there, unopened. It contained letters, confessions, receipts, the proof of everything he had tried to hide. I touched it gently and smiled, not with cruelty, not with hatred, but with satisfaction. I had loved him once, deeply. But love doesn't have to mean blindness. I had the patience to wait, the clarity to act, the intelligence to let truth and consequence do the work I couldn't do in anger. Months later, the nurse's words came back to me. She walked out and let the truth take over. They didn't understand it then. They might not even realize it now. But that's exactly what happened. I never flaunted my victory. I didn't need to. Friends, family, even strangers still think I was just a grieving widow. They don't know that every hidden account collapsed. Every shell company he created was exposed. And every secret that was meant to protect him instead protected me. And the best part, he never saw it coming. Never had a chance to fight back. Never got the last word. I finally visited the hospital again, years later. Not out of grief, but out of closure. I passed the nurses' station, and they looked at me with quiet respect this time. One whispered, "You were brilliant." I smiled politely and walked on. No explanation. No justification. Just silence, because silence had always been my ally. Now, when I think about that day I kissed him goodbye and stepped out of the room, I don't feel guilt. I don't feel anger. I feel power. I feel clarity. I feel freedom. He left this world thinking he had the upper hand. I left it knowing I always would. And the most satisfying revenge, the one that lingers long after the world forgets. It's quiet, it's patient, it's absolute, and it's mine.